All right. Hello, everybody. So the next session is about designing engagement into your application. And this is one of those things where it strikes me that we would all love to have the most engaging app ever, right? Like Plants vs. Zombies or Angry Birds or whatever. So I'm really looking forward to what we're going to learn in the next hour. Thanks.
Thank you. So hi, I'm Jamie Newberry. I work with Black Pixel. I'm the director of user experience over there. And prior to that, I was with a company called Zappos. And Louis, I'll have to talk to you about that app icon sometime. The one that's there now is one I wouldn't support in any way as well. But that's another story altogether. So I'm going to talk about some app engagement. And one of the things, I guess, when I think about app engagement, I immediately think of a gap. And the gap is, one of the gaps is when people hear about a product and then they understand the value of the product. And there's this space in between there. Another gap is once they understand the value, then how do we sustain the value over time? So I want to talk a little bit about well, gaps. Gaps are opportunities. Opportunities to do what? We can create barriers, or we can connect and engage. And hopefully, we're not going to create barriers. But sometimes we do, right? Sometimes it's unintentional. So one of the things that we want to really consider with the people that are going to be using our apps are the first time they engage with the app. We've heard a lot of stuff in this conference so far about, really prepare. We heard marketing, about how you plan for the app and how you spread the word. We talked about the app icon, which is a user's first contact with the app. But we want to make sure once they launch the app that we're introducing the concept. And I know this seems like a no-brainer. We all talk about the onboarding experience and introducing the concept. But how many of you have seen really complicated tutorial screens? Like, this isn't terribly terrible, but I've seen a few where it's just like, oh, wow, there's a lot of stuff there. And then the moment that I move on, I don't remember more than maybe 1 or 2 points that I saw, and I'm just going to try to use it and figure it out on my own. And in the same realm, there's the intro screens with the pagination, and sometimes those are great, and sometimes they just feel like they go on forever before you actually get in there and get to use the app. So, I don't know, here's one that I was kind of like, oh boy, there's a lot of information on these screens, and the text, there's a lot of, it feels like a lot of text to me. It feels like a lot of text and a lot of instructions and a lot of like, here's a piece of the interface and this and this and this. And the good thing is they did the thing at the bottom there where you can, I guess I can use this. I'm so bad about this. So there's the little things at the bottom where you can get out. So, I'm going to say that if you are going to do this sequence of intro screens to explain every single thing about your app, give people a bit of an escape. Because if you don't, like this is 4 screens long, and they're nicely designed. They explain the message, the concept of the app. But after, just like with that crazy tutorial screen, after like 3 or 4 screens of sliding through and just wanting to get into the app to experience it, I don't remember anything they said. I don't know about you guys, but I don't. Usually I'm just going to take I just want to get in here, okay? Like the first screen, it explains what it is. Welcome to Duolingo. Learning a language, fun and free. This is good. They explain what it is to a certain degree. If you need a lot more than that to explain your app, you might really want to consider some of the content strategy stuff that was just talked about. This one I really liked, and no bias toward working with the former Square designer. But this one I really liked, and I wanted to say, why can't we all just keep it so simple, right? Their concept in general is so simple that it's pretty easy to explain, but it's really considered. It's Square Register, accept credit cards today, and then sign up or sign in. And then the image itself is really supportive. It creates sort of an emotional engagement. You can connect, you can relate. Maybe how and what context. Context is really important. Am I going to use this? This is a farmer's market, and it's blurry, but it was considered. It was really considered, and I think that comes across. They could all only be so simple. So empathy. Empathy is a thing that we want to think about in our user experience in general, and I'm putting a little bit of the emphasis on that first part of the gap in when they learn what your product is, and then when they understand the value, empathize with the experience they're going through. So, if we give them all this information up front, like some of those pagination screens or paginated screens that explain everything about the experience before they get into it, it gets a little overwhelming. We've given them so much information before they've even gotten a chance to look at the app. You're trying to show them pieces and whatnot. I'd really question your approach if you feel like you need a sequence of screens to explain what your app does. Is it focused? But empathize. Imagine your user. I think Kat, the marketing talk, talked about busy moms being a huge user base, and think about their time. Think about any user's time, but as an example, empathize with what they're trying to do in the context in which they're using your app. Defining objectives is hugely important, and it's sort of a connective tissue in my mind. In that, I define those two gaps. First, they hear about the product. Then we have to convince them that there's value for them in the product, and then we need to sustain that value. So I think in defining objectives, we can help them understand at a more emotional level what is going to be important about your app. So when we define objectives, this is kind of a subtle way. I just pulled Twitter up. When you walk through the sequence, so you've signed up for the app, and then you get to a welcome screen that says, you're on Twitter. Now let's coax you through actually populating the app so that when you get there, it's not this empty, lonely space. You don't want people to get into your app and have a lonely space. So if you're going to take their time explaining what your app does, make it useful. So this does walk you through a series of steps, but you're actually pulling information into the app so that when they get to sort of the end of the line there, into the app and get to use it, they've already got stuff going on. You've filled it with information that's useful to actually making the app make sense. So gamification, I'm not going to delve too deeply into this, but it's similar to what we just talked about with the Twitter thing. Giving people information and helping them build the stuff that's going to be in their app. With gamification, any game players out here? Come on. So yeah, with games, what the cool thing is that you get a general sense for what the game is, and then you kind of instructions are unfolded along the way, right? As you need them. You're going to battle somebody, and then it has you do a little interaction. I like tower defense games. They're fun. So they introduce little things that you need to know along the way, but not up front. They don't give you a 6-screen tutorial up front that says, here's everything you need to know about how to defeat your opponent in this game, because that would be overwhelming. So think of it in the same way. And Josh Clark did a really great talk that I saw last year called Buttons Are a Hack. Anyway, Buttons Are a Hack. Look it up. You'll find him, Josh Clark. And he explains it in a beautiful, beautiful way. So if you want to get deeper into the right way to approach gamification, please look up that talk. Content strategy. I didn't realize we were going to have such a beautifully defined content strategy session. But what you just saw right before me, if you were lucky enough to catch that session, if you weren't here for that session, please watch the video with Louis and Des. Content strategy is hugely important. The words and the mindfulness that you put into your app, I don't need to say a lot because I think it was just said very well. But what tone you set, you can have fun with it. You can you can soften things, or you can scare people. whatever you want, but you need to be mindful and very intentional about what you say. And I have the same Twitter example that was from the last one. What are you doing and what's happening? The difference between those. You give people a sense by just that little change. You allow people to care. So, and I'll just step back real quick. When it's what are you doing? Did anybody use Twitter when it was what are you doing? A few of us. How many of you were like me in that first experience? I was like, nobody cares what I'm doing. Like who wants to know what I'm doing? But when it changed to what's happening, it creates the opportunity to actually discuss things that interest you as users. And this is what your users are looking for. The users of your apps are looking to find value, to share things they care about. And so a little wording change like that makes such a huge difference in how a person feels when they use your app. Are they scared and intimidated? Nobody wants to know what I'm doing. Or I can talk about what's happening in the world, in my life, whatever I choose that to be. It's a little more welcoming and warm. Get to know your users. So I don't mean this in necessarily like a data way, although that's important too. I mean this in more of an artificial intelligence sort of way, and Arya will talk more about that in greater depth. But if you're, and now we're getting into the territory of that sustained value. So if you're asking people, so we talked a little bit about the onboarding, right? Getting people to populate the app with information. If you're able to use artificial intelligence, if it makes sense for your app, to start to understand your users, the things that interest them, the things that are specific to them, they're going to really start to care about coming back. And that's how we can sustain their engagement over a longer period of time. We're constantly serving them new and fresh information based on what we know about them and what we continue to learn about them, and keep them coming back. Data. So data, of course, once we get something out there, and we've kind of considered a lot of stuff in actually getting our users to understand the value of our app, and they start using it, use the data to understand and observe. Watch, fail quickly, learn, try again. So observation. And I learned this a really long time ago in watching user testing and stuff. It's what people say they do and what they actually do is hugely different. There's a big margin there. So don't just ask people. I mean, asking is good, and there's a lot of valuable information there. But actually watch, observe. It was interesting. I was actually, on the first day of the conference, I was sitting in a table in the back, and somebody on the table in front of us was using the Black Pixel website. And I was just watching I was just distracted watching this person use it. And I saw a couple things, and I'm making copious notes. I'm like, oh my gosh, he's stuck on that. It's confusing. We need to change that. So, and then responding to data too. Don't get panicked and be, really, really scared about hearing one or two bad things, because the negative things are often the things people are most vocal about. But watch, aggregate the data, make adjustments that make sense for the strategy of your app. Intuition. So this is a big one that I guess I'm a big fan of, and I don't know that everybody is, but I put a lot of value in intuition. Sometimes, I'll tell a little story. I worked at Zappos, and I helped build the first mobile apps there. We started with iPad, so I guess we kind of did two things that were a little more intuition-based than we might have normally done. So we had all the data for the site. We knew who our target users were, like women in their 45 and up range, and we had a lot of site data, and then we had iPad data. So the iPad, and the context of time was hugely important when we did the Zappos iPad app. The context of time was, it was June 2010, so iPad had just come out in April, and so the adoption, people were getting it. We had some statistics of who was buying up all the iPads and stuff, and when the iPad or the mobile projects came to me at Zappos, one of the first things we said was, let's start with iPad instead of iPhone, even though they had been trying to get a mobile app out for 6 months prior to that. with no success, we decided to switch gears and focus on the iPad app simply because of timing. Timing is a huge, important thing, and the intuition that we the call we made was, let's go with iPad because there aren't a lot of shopping apps out there actually doing this right. It was basically, we were seeing shopping apps on the iPad that were the iPhone app made bigger, and it wasn't contextual. And so that was an intuition call. And then the other intuition call was, instead of targeting our users that we knew existed, Zappos already has a huge customer base, yes, but we need to create an experience that is going to actually appeal to the people critiquing apps right now. So our target audience was actually app critics for the iPad. And we wanted to please them or make them hate it, one or the other. And the response was very positive. But the intuition to go with that was it was a little scary and it met some resistance, but going with it actually proved to be a good decision. So this is a super, super, super overview. When you talk about engagement, when we talk about creating, designing engagement, I think of filling gaps. And filling gaps not in a way that creates barriers, but thinking about a lot of those things that we just talked about to actually engage and create an emotional connection with your users. That emotional connection, I tend to be really guilty of this, but I get super intensely passionate about stuff, and then I'm like, yeah, we got to make this decision. That's my intuition, sort of a conflict of battle. Anyway, but filling gaps, think about that emotional engagement. Think about the emotional engagement, because I really think that that's kind of where it's at when you want to engage with people. Aria.
Okay. Hi, my name is Aria, and I'll be talking about how artificial intelligence can be used to design engagement as well as improve the overall user experience of an app. I'm the co-founder of a startup called Prismatic, and my background's a little different than a lot of people here. I'm primarily, over the last decade, have been an artificial intelligence researcher. I have a PhD in artificial intelligence. I've done work at Google and Microsoft on AI products and a ton of consulting. And invariably, whenever I tell people that I'm an artificial intelligence researcher, their mind immediately drifts to the science fiction worldview of what AI is. They ask me, where are the robots? Where are the sarcastic robots? When are they going to destroy us? And unfortunately, I have to let them down and tell them, no, in reality, most artificial intelligence is in fact just software. They're software agents which are behaving intelligently. And in fact, artificial intelligence is already here and has been for years and been a crucial component of a lot of products that you already use. And so the goal of my talk today is going to be talking about how AI and UX kind of work together, what that flow looks like, and give you some examples. So the core thesis of most of my examples will be that AI is really about estimating what the user intent is, what the user response is, the user context, and those are all key components of user experience. If an app has a goal, then it's the job of the AI to do a better job of guessing how the user might react or what's the best way to get a user towards that goal. And so again, most of the talk will be talking about concrete examples, and I'll talk about some future directions and some general things that I've noticed when AI is actually integrated into applications. So my first example is from many years ago. Before we all had MacBooks, there was a time when a ThinkPad was not a crazy choice. And there was a great innovation on the ThinkPad with this pointer stick here. And I don't know how many people remember, but this isometric joystick was actually much better on the ThinkPad than other things. And that was largely because of something called negative inertia. And so I'll flash this equation up here. Negative inertia was describing how it was that when a user changed direction, the velocity of the response would change depending on what the user's gestures were. So put quite simply, it would have this rubber band-like effect that when you would change directions or stop, the velocity would rapidly change. And this doesn't match anything in the physical world. But IBM actually spent a lot of time developing this equation and actually tuning it on real user subjects in order to get the kind of right kinesthetic usability. And it actually makes a huge difference to the feeling of responsiveness. Now, I use this example because I reckon that something quite similar is going on with inertial scroll on iOS. So that rubber band kind of bouncing effect, I think, draws very heavily upon what was working just UI-wise with these old ThinkPads. And it's a crucial part. So if any of you have used kind of scrolls on other devices like Androids, the physics feel kind of off. And the physics feel kind of off corresponds, I think, a lot to not thinking seriously enough about equations for how to change velocity and things that will actually yield a positive user experience. An example now that you're probably more familiar with is on the iPhone. So the iPhone does something really interesting called dynamic key target resizing. So if I type in COFFE on the iPhone, there is a letter which is most likely to come next, right? And so I've highlighted circles of whose radius indicates how likely that next letter is. And so given what I've typed so far, the E is obviously the most likely next choice, because people rarely say coffer in text messages, but coffee is pretty common. Now, what the iPhone actually does is that the target area of those different letters, despite the fact that the UI elements are the same size, the target area of the more likely letter is actually larger. And so if you're wondering, how is it that my fat finger is typing this correctly, the answer is it's not. The answer is that there is artificial intelligence which is making that keyboard input way better. And again, this is something that I think makes the Apple keyboard on the iOS devices far better than most other ones. There's actually a lot of research on how to do touch keyboards much better that doesn't exist on any device. And I can talk about that later with people if they're interested. But these small kind of things make a huge difference, and they're all about AI. So now I'm going to talk about something a little different. So we've talked about kind of UI gestures and how it is that AI kind of goes into making those feel good. I'm going to talk a little bit now about some actual products, and in particular, I'm going to talk about Google mobile search. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but I'm going to just draw attention to what's actually happening here. When you type coffee on a mobile browser, you're likely to get search results that look like this. You'll get a map, and you'll get a bunch of point of interest information, because it's assuming that you're actually looking to find coffee, right? Whereas if you search for coffee brewing, you get the normal kind of search results, which is because the system thinks that you're actually looking for content rather than actually going and doing something, right? And so everyone's familiar with seeing kind of slightly different search results, but I just want to draw attention that it's a relationship to the intent of the user, right? So obviously, all of Google is doing a lot of AI, but in this particular way, what they're doing is there's a model of what the user is trying to do with the inputs that they've provided. So is the user looking for a place, or are they looking for content? And in this particular instance, the probability that someone is, given that I'm looking for a place, I'm going to type coffee, whereas it's much less likely that I'm looking for content if I type coffee. Okay, and so most of the models that do stuff like this, speech recognition, all these things work on this same idea of what's more or less likely given the observations that they've seen. The other thing that's important here is there's a little bit of understanding of the user context. And in this particular instance, it's location. In order to do something smart, I need to know where you are, but it's not limited to that. It could be, am I actually likely personally myself to look for coffee? And in my particular case, the answer is yes, but for other people, it might not be. Okay, so here's kind of the first lesson. Even though I gave you that whole spiel about how they do the smart job guessing whether or not you're looking for a place or you're looking for content, it turns out that they also mix in a bunch of normal search results when you search for coffee. And the reason is because they are, quite frankly, often very wrong. And one of the key lessons in designing AI in a product is to learn to hedge against errors. Everything will make errors, and to the extent that it feels like a seamless product experience is how good of a fallback that you have, right? So for instance, if I search for coffee brewers, I would probably get content results because the system doesn't know that I'm just using hipster speak for coffee. So there's a great example about what Evernote does in this area that I think is absolutely fantastic and really subtle and makes a huge difference to like how making the product work better that you can ask me about in Q&A or offline if you'd like. So this next example is a little different. It's about the Facebook newsfeed. This is probably the most consumed newsfeed in the world. And actually, how many people know that this thing is actually a trained model that's predicting how to sort the search results? Yeah, so there's actually quite a sophisticated model that's going on here. And in fact, what the people who made Facebook Newsfeed decided was that they want people to interact as soon as possible and as early as possible on a newsfeed item. And so for them, the product goal was, I want people to like something as early as possible, particularly on a mobile device. This obviously makes sense, because if the first item that you want to like is 4 or 5 down, you may decide to go away. And so it was a conscious choice that the way that they were going to measure what they considered engagement was likes. And that probably makes sense, because to a first approximation product-wise, Facebook is a big vehicle for people giving and getting likes, and friends are merely a vehicle for doing that. And I think that makes a lot of sense for kind of, I think, the way they view engagement. And they have an algorithm for how they actually rank these things. And they've released these details about it, and I'll just quickly explain what happens. When an item is on your newsfeed, its score consists of 3 components. The first is affinity. How much do you actually care about the person who shared this item? Like, how much do you care about what they have to say in general? The second is the weight of the item. Is it a news story? Is it a photo? How much am I likely to care about each of those kinds of things? And the last is the time decay. All things equal, I prefer to have an item which is newer. OK, and so here I'm going to do my one and only slide about machine learning. Obviously, I've not omitted any details whatsoever. This is the complete picture. But there's two parts of machine learning that are important to understand, I think, for everyone to understand. Because people often think that machine learning is this technical thing that doesn't have anything to do with kind of like creativity or artistic choices, and that's completely false. So there's a part of machine learning which says, I have a model of how I think my data works and how the world works that's connected to what I'm trying to do. In this case, get a bunch of likes, figure out which items have a bunch of likes. And then there's a bunch of data about how people actually behave, right? All machine learning is really about how you take those models and those data and you make parameters that tweak the performance of the model to actually reach the objective that you're trying to do. That's the technical part of machine learning. There's this other side of it that anyone can do, is technical or not, that I actually think from my experience is far more important, which is what is the model? What is important to try to actually capture? What are we actually trying to do? What are the objectives? That part is actually less technical, and that's mostly about domain and product knowledge. So going to the Facebook newsfeed, how is it that they actually decide what counts as an engaging item? What makes something have a higher score? So if you take a newsfeed item, there's this idea of doing kind of feature engineering. So Facebook decided 2 things. They decided, 1, we want to optimize for engagement via likes and commenting on stories. And how are we going to model or think about what attributes are relevant to that decision? And they have things like this. Well, does the item actually have a big picture? Right? And you don't need to understand how weights and parameters are optimized to know that that attribute might be relevant for deciding whether or not someone might interact with a news story. How many likes does it have? Are people commenting? Now, it's not some huge revelation that people like big pictures, right? In some sense, that lesson has been overlearned in the last 18 months or so, I think, when looking at products that are popular. The thing that machine learning buys you is the principled trade-off between this. How much better is it to have 5 times as many likes and have a big picture? Is it 2 times better? 3 times better? Who knows what the answer is, but the point is what the machine learning buys you is the precise trade-off between these different attributes and the freedom to kind of throw the kitchen sink about all the things that might be relevant to what's guiding a user action towards an engagement. Guiding the user action towards liking. So quickly, I'm going to give an example that comes from my own product, Prismatic. Just really briefly, what we do is we're a smart newsfeed that learns from interests and things. So for instance, I'm really into science fiction and comic books and kind of the items that I get belie that. We're currently iPhone and web. And the background of the people who do this, including myself, is that we have quite a bit of machine learning and kind of general user experience design. And a lot of what we're doing is kind of based upon merging those 2 together, quite like this talk itself. And there's a broader vision, blah, blah, blah. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we build because it's relevant. We obviously do a lot of things like crawl the entire internet for content. And even this is an example where there's actually quite a bit of AI in a web crawler. People think that web crawling is just start a million threads and a million requests rather and go and get. And it turns out there's not. There's quite a lot of bit of modeling that goes into actually crawling successfully. Part Part of what we do is we build a lot of topic models. We take a lot of content and we say, this one's about neuroscience, this one's about user experience, this one's about cognitive science. And there's a product reason why we do that I'll talk about in just another slide. A lot of what we do is also social graph analysis. We look at, like the Facebook item from earlier, how much do I care about what this person has to say who's a friend? How much do I care about what someone else has to say who's 2 degrees away that I'm not friends with? And there are models there. And finally, there's kind of relevance ranking. There's understanding how much does a user care about the Atlantic publication. So when you see an item in a prismatic newsfeed, what we're doing is we're looking at how much do I actually care about theatlantic.com? How much do I actually care about technology versus user experience as a topic? What am I actually clicking on? Do I like stuff that's long? Do I like something that's short? Stuff like this. So there's a sophisticated model of kind of all the attributes of what a user might care about. OK, so now here's actually the point I was trying to get to with all this. What actually guides the decision about how we actually rank stories? So as I mentioned, and as you can imagine from the last slide, we can do a thing which is looking at, for a given article, we know what topics it's about, we know what publisher it is, we know how long or short it is, and we can match that up against what we know about a user from observing what they click on, what they're reading, their dwell time on certain stories, what they're sharing, et cetera, et cetera. We can obviously just do a straightforward what has the highest overlap with what you care about, and that would be totally valid. We do something a little different. One of the things we learned via user testing early on was that just providing people with relevant stuff actually wasn't that interesting long-term for engagement. And so something else that we do is we're aware of how redundant articles or distinct articles are from previous things that you've seen. Okay? So obviously when we rank stuff, we're actually trading off between these two. We're saying there's a component which is like, what do you actually, we know you care about, and what's different than other stuff you've seen. Now, what's going on here is we're operationalizing a definition of serendipity. Serendipity is not just random stuff that you see. It's stuff that you like, but that's different than other things that you're interested in, right? And so part of what doing AI is taking these kind of fuzzy concepts and operationalizing them into computational definitions. And that's precisely what we're doing here. And here's kind of the larger, let me stand on my soapbox goal of telling you this. Algorithms are editorial. There's this complete misconception that people have, and in fact, it's enshrined in law, this idea that algorithms are, if you have an algorithm for doing something, you're not legally liable for it, right? This is often sort of the Google defense about search results. Algorithms are designed to have bias. That's the whole point. They're designed to do something. They don't come down from the heavens. You have a goal, and an algorithm is an implement for that goal. And that's an important thing to understand, both for product design. Legally, I think there's a huge mess that we're about to get into once algorithms become more widespread, but they're there for a reason. So on the previous slide, what I showed you, this trading off of relevance and diversity because we think it's important to show users a broad range of things, that's a product choice. There's no math god that came down and told us to do that. So it would have been fine to do lots of other things. It would have been fine merely to select the most popular item that was shared within your network. Totally fine, people do that. But the reason why we chose this is because we think that was an important thing. And so the key point here is that algorithms are actually give you more flexibility as a product designer. It kind of pushes up these decisions about what's important higher up in the stack. It's kind of an abstract idea, but I think it's an important one to kind of start spreading out into the zeitgeist. OK, so I'm off my soapbox, and I'm going to tell you about, I'm going to actually get on a different soapbox now. So I'm going to talk about some AI UX issues that I've seen in other apps. And so the primary one is avoid the black box. So by that I mean it's important to explain why a user is seeing something if it's not easy to understand. So for instance, on Twitter, you understand the model about why you're seeing the tweets you're seeing. And that's comforting, and it totally makes sense, and you're not confused about this. But when it comes to machine learning, and I think this will become more of a problem, explaining why a user is seeing something is as important as doing a good job of showing them relevant content. So for instance, Netflix does a great job with this. When they recommend a movie, they'll do multiple things. They'll say, oh, The Shining is like Caddyshack. I mean, this is obviously a joke example. I mean, it's actually a real example. But yeah, I mean, it's important to say, we think you'll like this movie because of these reasons. They also have those great taglines like, because you're into dark romantic comedies and all these other things. These things are basically a fiction. So the real Netflix model, you cannot interpret the results of their prediction algorithm. So if they were to really put up a real description of what they were doing, it would say, well, when we project your ratings over all things into a lower dimensional space with all the other users in the world, it turns out your dot product with this movie is a little higher than other things. And so a lot of what's going on here is more or less even a separate model to predict and give the reasons why we should display to someone here. So it's that important. So my goal wasn't to make fun of them, but to say it's that important to do a good job explaining why that you can even write a different model for it. And so in our case, what we do is rather than just show people the name of an article, we highlight in orange, in this case for me, that's a machine learning article, and you're going to care because of this reason. Or we know you like the normal deviate publisher, and so that will get highlighted in orange, or a publisher will get highlighted in orange, or we'll put a little border around a user that shared an item, and we're showing them of the social, topic, publisher, author kind of attributes, which of these is actually why you might care about something. And that's globally important. So here's my little last tip. This is called use natural data. So the first generation of AI apps, I think, did this really bad thing that I knew in academia was a bad idea, but kind of hadn't percolated out, which is they tried to learn from their own internal actions. So really precisely, I don't mean to pick on them, but Pandora did this. So they have users say, well, OK, we need to learn what's a good and a bad track for a user, a good and bad artist. And so they're like, well, why don't we just have people thumbs up and thumbs down stuff? And everyone's seen this kind of interaction before. I actually think it's a bad idea to learn off of data, which is not something a user might naturally do if your product wasn't learned. There's technical reasons for that, like you get this weird bias thing where you're not learning what a user might naturally do. You're kind of learning what they do when they become self-conscious of the fact that you're asking them what they think. And then you get into all sorts of weird territory there. It's much better to learn, as I'm sure Pandora does now, off of natural actions. Is the user repeating this track? Are they skipping it? Are they rewinding it? What are they doing? And that's actually much better. This is the computational corollary of what Jamie was saying with watch what users do and not what they say. So this is the same idea where people do very different things when you draw out a specific UI element that they think is for learning or not. A related example, which is actually good and subtly different, is Facebook. So Facebook obviously learns from likes, but it's actually different because users have external reasons to take a like action. It's primarily a social action that may also happen to have something to do with learning. And it's a subtle distinction, but I think it's an important one. So message, learn from things that users actually do. Don't make up. If you're doing it so that you need this other kind of fake data that people wouldn't do, it's probably not going to work out. OK, winter is coming. So part of the reason I'm here is because there's a serious problem. There's been a lot of kind of promises of AIs and apps and everything, and a lot of them haven't panned out. And I think a lot of it is for a bunch of reasons. Some of it is technical. A lot of the people who've done stuff with machine learning and AI before and trumpeted it actually, ironically, haven't been the most technically great at it. And there's another issue, which is how it actually fits into the product in such a way that you barely notice is there. It's actually really important. And so you kind of have to do a good job on both the technical side of things and thinking a lot about what kind of AI will make sense in this product. And I think on both of those counts, a lot of the kind of newer wave of machine learning is doing better at. And I've got some examples, and feel free to come and ask me. But I will suffice it to say that doesn't mean you should kind of throw out the whole area. Machine learning and AI can have a dramatic effect on user experience if you're actually thoughtful about how to do it. And I've hoped to convince you with past examples that people have, in fact, been really thoughtful about it, and there's a lot out there. OK, thanks. So you can get more information about both Prismatic and myself, and come and grab me during lunch or whatever. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you. So we can come out here and we'll ask questions. I have a couple. We have about 10 minutes, so we have time for a couple of questions from the audience as well, so go ahead and tweet those. So I have a question about machine learning first. So things like Flipboard, Twitter even, and Facebook and so forth, it seems like there's the possibility that creates an echo chamber around what you already believe. You don't want to know anything, or you don't find anything else because of that. Is there a way you could use machine learning to sort of help people to understand alternative opinions or alternative areas of thought?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the effect that you're describing is a natural consequence of you choose followers or whatever, and you choose sources, and you just get content from those. And it's certainly the case that you can use machine learning to have an objective to say, I actually want to show this user stuff that they haven't seen before, and I want to show them stuff from another political leaning. Right? So it's actually not that hard to say classify, give a liberal, more conservative sources, and that can be a conscious choice that an algorithm can take. And if a user is willing to engage in experience where part of the messaging of the entire product was, this app is not going to reconfirm what you believe, and it's actually going to show you stuff that's different, that would totally be valid. And in fact, we do a little bit of that as I described in the talk.
Oh,
right?
Excellent. Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to search Twitter real quick, but I also have a couple of my own questions, put together a couple of other ones. So when you're measuring engagement for like a design that you've built for users, how do you measure that before you've spent all the time to put that design together and get it out in front of people? Like, what do you do? I've done a lot of design, most of it not very good because I'm not a designer by trade, but I spend a lot of time sort of thinking through what my app should look like, and then I don't know what to do to find out if that's actually engaging or if it's just me stuck in my own head or whatever. So what do you do to test it, to figure it out?
Do you want to take that, or do you?
I
don't know.
Sure. So despite the fact that I gave a big talk about machine learning, I think the first pass at everything has to be intuition, right? Machine learning isn't going to make you have a good design set of choices or whatever. It can help you select amongst a bunch of them. So for instance, like microcopy, say, for instance. Like microcopy can be good if you have 5 microcopy choices doing some machine learning. And by the way, don't do A/B testing. That's probably not the best way to do something like that. It can help you decide amongst those 5 things which is actually in a very precise way generating the most signups, the most actions, or whatever. But it can't actually help you do that first step. So that's kind of the machine learning perspective on that, is it doesn't help with that first step. That's, to me, more about intuition and kind of smaller, more focused, talking to people and showing people. And machine learning can't solve those problems.
And I guess to expand on that a little bit too, before you embark on a project, you often establish what you're trying to accomplish with it. If you're working with a client project, like Zappos, for instance, we had a really specific goal, like sell things on the site, make it easy. That was the initial goal, and over time their goal has changed, and so the direction of the app has changed. But looking at how people use that over time, analytics and statistics and stuff, and then responding to that and listening to user feedback, those are a huge piece of that.
Excellent. Thanks. So here's one from Twitter. What's the simplest test app that I can write to learn how to build models of my app users?
Stump the panel. I don't know.
I'm actually not even sure what the simplest. I need a little more constraint than that. But maybe I'll do a slight dodge. I mean, I think that there's very few apps I can think of that wouldn't benefit from some amount of predictive user stuff. So like to-do lists, tagging to-dos is actually a great idea. Nobody actually does it. Or I don't, unless I happen to be consciously like indulging in kind of OCD behavior. But so I actually think, observing the kinds of tags that people apply on a to-do list app and guessing based upon the text of the to-do what to put there, that's a really simple example. You can find enough online to kind of build something like that, and just to get us a flavor of how to do that. But I actually think that almost every kind of popular consumer app can benefit probably from a little bit of user modeling.
So along those same lines, in terms of trying to get your head wrapped around machine learning, there are a lot of massively open online courses today that have some either are artificial intelligence specifically or have machine learning. I think Caltech has one. I think Stanford has one. Is that a good place to start? Or if all of us wanted to go out and learn about machine learning in order to integrate it into our apps, would that be a good place to start, or is it too much, too deep?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, for instance, on Andrew Ng's machine learning course on Coursera is great. I mean, I paid $40,000 to take it at Stanford in the early 2000s, and it's free online now, which is great. But I should emphasize that, unfortunately, that doesn't negate the student loans. But like, believe it or not, the actual, as I tried to hint throughout the talk, the technical part of machine learning is only like 15% of it. I spend much more time thinking about like setting up like the problem itself and how it relates to what the app is trying to do. And 85% of the thinking is about like what signals that are naturally occurring in an app make sense. And so actually, I would actually tell people to not to learn enough to like know the very basics, but to spend most of the time thinking about how to instrument the app with machine learning in a way that makes sense. Because I actually think that is 90% of it, but oddly, kind of if you look on Hacker News or everywhere, people seem to overemphasize the math technical part of it and not the actual harder bit of it. So I would encourage people to get rid of the approach avoidance and deal with the hard problem of how does this make sense in an app.
Okay, so that brings to mind another question that I wanted to ask about the analytics that you put in your app. So specifically when you're doing a design and you make a decision, like I'm going to put this button here, or I'm going to make this color, or I'm going to put this gradient or whatever, all of those are sort of decisions around trying to get people to engage with the app more fully. How do you instrument that? Do you actually do some sort of A/B testing kind of thing, or do you put two different things and you capture analytics about it? And then so you have to have that to capture the data, but then you also have to be able to analyze that on the back end. And some of the things that I've read about analytics is people end up capturing a lot of data but have no clue how to use it. And so they look at the very simple surface information and make decisions based on that, but there's actually a much richer set of detail in there. And so I was wondering, one, if you could talk about how you instrument, and then two, once you get it instrumented, what do you do with the data?
Wow, that's it's funny, I mean, just an interesting thing that you see with knowing what to do with the data is people can interpret the data in different ways too. So getting people sort of unified across if you're working with multiple people, on defining what your goals in the data are, what you're trying to find out, and then pulling the information and actually looking at a few key points. That's a little overview. But.
Yeah, so this is my personal opinion. There's actually even people in Prismatic who disagree with me about this, but I actually don't collect data unless I've thought through what decision I want to make based upon it. So like, and that, because you end up in this world where you invest a lot of time and infrastructure into collecting a bunch of stuff, but until you actually have a use case for like, okay, well, I'm going to collect, for instance, like it makes sense to collect the browser information along with conversion information on like a landing sign-up funnel, because it could be that, it may be that Windows users are signing up less at some step, and that's because you just have the CSS blowout. So I think through flows like this before we usually instrument. Again, that's controversial. I mean, there's some people who like to just collect everything and deal with it later. I find that leads to poor kind of instrumentation as well as like data collect. I tend to be a big fan of being concrete about what it is I want to do with data before I actually collect any.
It's probably good from a privacy concern, too, for you to know what you're doing and why you're doing it. So this is another question about that engagement flip, where you get people to actually be engaged. So once you have this data, what's the most important way, or maybe this is sort of the same question, just asked a different way, what's the most important way to know what to flip? And do you have to have some A/B testing where once you flip it, you could flip it back to see if conversions happen more, if people sign up better, or they buy more stuff, or like how do you know what to tweak? And then once you tweak it, how do you know if you've done the right thing? Do you have to be able to switch back and forth? Because it's hard on iOS. You deliver the app and you're done unless you build a sentient app that can download its configuration from the interwebs and reconfigure itself on the fly.
Well, that's an interesting point. I don't think that just because you've shipped an app, you're done. It should be constant observation. If you want to really engage people over a long duration, I think making changes, something that happens a lot, especially when you're shipping an app, is trying to make a lot of changes with every rollout, and maybe not being as mindful about what changes you make. Sometimes if you change like 2 or 3 things, and just because you got the feedback on that, you change all 3 and release again, and then you don't know which one actually increased or hurt the outcome. So being really mindful about which ones you choose to roll out is a pretty important thing.
Yeah, I mean, +1, I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to be scientific about it, right, though, because you can't, it's not an experiment, it's just to throw it out there.
You got to choose your priorities, too, prioritize what's important for the business and the objectives that you're trying to do, and marry those back to what you're seeing in the data.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again. It was fascinating. Great stuff. Thanks.
Thank you.